my name is Sam and I'm the Grand Prospirator of corporate learning. These days I'm thinking that I'm the Grand Prospirator of other things as well. Anyhow, I was doing a bit of reflection on some studies in my doctorate program on hermeneutics. Now, first of all, it's kind of interesting that we're studying hermeneutics in my doctorate class because traditionally speaking, it's the interpretation of texts, usually the Bible. But yeah, we're doing a study on hermeneutics, and one of the really cool things that we've been looking at is the hermeneutic wheel, in which there are kind of different dimensions, and there's different kind of versions of the hermeneutic wheel, but essentially two major dimensions in the hermeneutic wheel is one, looking at how the whole and the parts kind of relate, and then also looking at how pre-understanding informs understanding. Now, I was sitting in church the other day and listening to a sermon, and it was actually kind of interesting because you can apply the hermeneutic wheel to this. And the sermon was on the Sermon on the Mount. And one of the interesting things about this text is that now this sermon is typically, when you read it in the Bible, it's broken into different categories. So there's a category or a kind of section on do not worry. There's another section on where you store your treasures, and another one on kind of giving to the needy. So somebody in their need to help classify or help it make it easier for the reader has put in these subcategories. But actually what I find is that it's actually quite detrimental to the interpretation of the text. And in fact, actually, oftentimes that interpretation, I think, misses the mark. So I'll give you an example. So in this Sermon on the Mount, like Jesus is actually giving a sermon on, it's not good to store treasures on earth. It's better to store them in heaven. And because how those markers break it down, that's actually usually where kind of the pastors end. And essentially what they've done is put on two ends of the spectrum. It's not good to store on earth, therefore store in heaven. And that's actually where they kind of draw the main lesson. But if you actually kind of read on, it's not really about just where you store your treasure. In fact, it's almost like I would say that if you read the entire sermon, what the text is saying is that it's not great to focus on storing kind of your treasure, and it's not good to store on earth. It's better to store it in heaven if you're going to store anywhere. And you know what? But the better thing yet would be to not worry about storing. Because, even the birds of the air don't have to worry about storing because of who they are. And the focus of the text, when you read it in its whole, is actually about our identity as children of God. But unfortunately, many pastors actually end up kind of leaving it at, storing in heaven is the ultimate goal versus storing on earth. Now, I find this actually quite problematic, partly because if you lead it to its natural conclusion, at the end of the day, we do things and for reward, and it kind of goes back to a very mechanistic kind of perspective. And I don't think actually that's the real intent. See, it's kind of funny. I once had a business idea, and it was kind of a funny one, but I think relevant. In traditional Chinese society, we believe that when someone dies and they go into the other life, that their children should continue, for example, burning money or burning cars, or I've seen even entire buildings, so that their ancestors, their parents who have passed on in the afterlife will have these things. So one of these ideas that I had is that it'd be today there's more and more of the older generation that has no faith in the next generation to be kind of doing this on a regular basis for them. So, I figure that there's some sort of an exchange rate between real money, on Earth, like money on Earth, and this fake money that you burn, into the afterlife. So I was thinking, what if you offered a service to these older generations, just before they die? They said, hey, just as an insurance plan, I can be burning money for you into the afterlife, and this is the exchange rate. I mean, wouldn't that be cool? Just before they die, you're burning all this money. And actually, if you take this, it kind of sounds like a facetious example, right? But at the end of the day, this is actually what the sermons oftentimes advocate. Do not store on earth, store in heaven. Therefore, there must be some sort of exchange rate between, earth and heaven. And if the motivator at the end of the day is storing up, why don't you get somebody kind of burn money to you after you die? And in fact, actually, if you look into church history, there are certain examples of that. Buying your penance. So I kind of find that it's kind of interesting, but at the end of the day, the true interpretation of what is actually meant, you really need to look into both how does the parts fit into the whole, and it's detrimental for somebody else to categorize that for you. Second, I think it's actually also very important to look at your pre-understanding, like what kinds of assumptions, values drive your interpretation of something and how you understand. So as another example, it's very interesting. It's very easy to interpret the text in the way that I just interpreted it, or sorry, the pastors kind of usually interpret it. And that's because we live in Western society where individualism kind of rules. And so it's quite easy to say, at the end of the day, the driving motivation for you is accumulating reward. That's not a hard sell. So people actually, if you base your interpretation and you kind of trace it back, you have that kind of assumption or understanding behind. The other thing that you kind of might trace it to is, if the church is struggling with money, okay, like resources, it's very easy to go to preach this passage because, you essentially are creating a need for somebody to then kind of store up kind of in heaven by, for example, giving to the church. Now, don't get me wrong on any of this. I am not trying to criticize any of the pastors. I'm actually just talking about how the interpretation of text is quite easily kind of misinterpreted when you don't consider how the parts fit into the whole, and also how your pre-understanding informs your understanding.